The first thing Brenda did after sitting down at my dining table was pull a measuring tape out of her purse and start deciding where her mother's furniture would go inside my house. She said it all so casually while smiling over her coffee cup that for a few seconds I honestly thought I had misunderstood the conversation. But then she started assigning bedrooms, discussing basement storage, and talking about moving dates, like my home had already quietly transferred ownership without anyone bothering to tell me first. I remember sitting there at the head of the table with my hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee while sunlight spilled across the oak wood surface my husband built 30 years earlier. Trevor kept staring down at his slice of black forest cake like he hoped avoiding eye contact long enough might somehow erase the entire situation, while Brenda's mother Lorraine wandered slowly through the dining room, studying crown molding and window frames with the eager expression of someone inspecting a property before renovation. Nobody asked me anything. That was the part that settled most heavily inside my chest afterward. Not the audacity itself, the assumption. They were speaking around me instead of to me because somewhere along the way my opinion stopped feeling necessary to them. I've lived in that house for 42 years. My husband Daniel and I bought it during a brutal winter when mortgage rates were so high. Everyone told us we were insane for trying, but Daniel used to say people build homes during difficult years, precisely because stability matters most when life feels uncertain. We spent decades inside those walls, raising Trevor, arguing over wallpaper, fixing broken pipes, hosting Christmas dinners, and slowly shaping every room into something deeply tied to the rhythm of our lives together. After Daniel died, the house became emotionally sacred to me in ways I never fully explained to anyone else. His reading glasses still sat inside the kitchen drawer beside the refrigerator because I couldn't bring myself to move them. The workshop shelves in the garage still held tiny handwritten labels he made years ago, and every morning sunlight still hit the living room floor at exactly the same angle where he used to sit reading newspapers before work. Widowhood changes your relationship with objects. People who haven't experienced that kind of loss often assume older women cling too tightly to houses, furniture routines, and old photographs because we resist change emotionally. What they fail to understand is that memory becomes physical after enough years. Certain spaces stop feeling like property and start feeling like continuity itself. That house wasn't just real estate to me. It was the last place my life still felt fully recognizable. Brenda never understood that. From the beginning, she viewed the house practically rather than emotionally, which honestly would have been fine if practicality hadn't always seemed to benefit her personally. Ever since she married Trevor, she talked constantly about smart transitions, family consolidation, and planning for the future. But underneath all those polished phrases sat a much simpler reality. She wanted convenience. Their apartment downtown was expensive. Lorraine's retirement situation was becoming financially unstable, and my house represented the perfect solution because it already existed fully paid off with enough bedrooms for everyone involved. Brenda framed the idea like some beautiful multi-generational family arrangement where nobody would ever feel lonely again. But even during earlier conversations, I always noticed something unsettling underneath her enthusiasm. She spoke about my home like an opportunity, not a life. That distinction mattered more than Trevor ever realized. The measuring tape finally snapped softly back into place, while Brenda smiled across the table and casually mentioned how the basement would make a perfect private suite for Trevor, and her once Lorraine settled into the upstairs guest room permanently. Listening to her describe my own house back to me in rearranged pieces felt strangely surreal, because nobody had even asked whether I wanted another person living there full-time. They had simply skipped over that part. That's what entitlement does after enough time. It removes the need for permission entirely. I finally set my coffee cup down carefully onto the saucer, while the room continued moving around me in cheerful little fragments of conversation. The porcelain made a soft clink against the table, and somehow that tiny sound cut through the atmosphere more sharply than shouting probably would have. Then I said no. Just one word. Not loudly, not emotionally. Calmly enough that the entire room froze almost immediately afterward. I still remember the expression on Brenda's face because for the first time since arriving, she looked genuinely confused rather than confident. Trevor finally lifted his eyes from his dessert. Lorraine stopped touching the dining room curtains, and the air inside the house suddenly felt heavy with the kind of silence families create when everyone realizes an uncomfortable truth has finally entered the room. Brenda tried recovering first. She laughed softly in that polished artificial way people do when they think older women are simply being emotional or stubborn temporarily, then started explaining how I must have misunderstood what she meant. According to her, they were only trying to help because the house was too much responsibility for one person now that I was older. I remember leaning back slightly in my chair while listening to her speak because underneath all the fake concern sat the exact same assumption still waiting unchanged. My life was negotiable. My comfort was flexible, and my home would eventually become communal property simply because everyone else found that arrangement more convenient. The calmness inside me deepened after that realization instead of disappearing. "No," I repeated quietly. I understood perfectly. Trevor attempted smoothing things over almost immediately because that had become his role in nearly every difficult situation since childhood. He hated confrontation so intensely that he often confused avoidance with kindness, and over the years that weakness quietly shaped his entire marriage. Whenever Brenda pushed too hard emotionally, Trevor responded by becoming smaller, quieter, less visible. I used to mistake that behavior for patience when he was younger, but after Daniel died and I spent more time observing people carefully, I started understanding something much sadder about my son. Trevor wasn't peaceful. He was conflict avoidant. And conflict-avoidant people often allow deeply unfair situations to grow because disappointing stronger personalities terrifies them more than sacrificing themselves quietly, or sacrificing someone else quietly. That realization hurt me deeply while I sat there listening to him explain how everyone was just trying to think long-term. Brenda nodded beside him while Lorraine studied the floor awkwardly, and somewhere during those few minutes, I finally understood that this conversation had probably happened many times before privately without me present. They had already emotionally moved into my house long before they physically tried. The conversation deteriorated slowly after that. Brenda stopped pretending the arrangement was optional and started framing it like practical necessity instead. Lorraine had already broken her apartment lease in Phoenix. Moving costs were increasing, and according to Brenda, family takes care of family during difficult stages of life. That phrase almost made me laugh. People usually invoke family obligation most aggressively when they are volunteering someone else's labor money or space instead of their own. I stood quietly and began collecting dessert plates from the table, while Brenda continued talking, because by then I already knew the discussion itself no longer mattered very much. Once someone reveals they view your boundaries as temporary obstacles rather than actual limits, arguments stop accomplishing anything useful. The truth is already visible. I remember carrying dishes toward the kitchen sink while explaining very calmly that guests were always welcome in my home, but permanent residents were another matter entirely. Lorraine was free to explore senior communities nearby, and I would happily help research options if necessary. But nobody was moving into my house simply because they had already emotionally decided the outcome beforehand. Brenda's expression hardened immediately after that. The warmth disappeared first, then the politeness. For the first time since arriving, she looked at me less like family and more like an obstacle. That shift clarified everything. After they finally left that evening, the silence inside the house felt strangely different than usual. Normally, after family visits, I wandered through the rooms feeling mildly lonely once everyone disappeared again. But that night, the quiet carried something much heavier underneath it. Awareness. I moved slowly through the kitchen, rinsing coffee cups while replaying the conversation in my mind. And what unsettled me most wasn't Brenda's entitlement anymore. It was Trevor's silence. At no point during that entire conversation did my son clearly defend my right to remain comfortable inside my own home. He softened things, redirected tension, and tried smoothing emotional edges constantly, but he never once firmly said the house belonged to me, and therefore the decision belonged entirely to me, too. That absence mattered, because silence eventually becomes agreement when repeated long enough. I carried my tea into the living room afterward and sat in Daniel's old armchair near the front window while darkness settled quietly outside. The house creaked softly around me, the way old homes always do at night, and for the first time since becoming widowed, I suddenly understood how easily older women disappear psychologically inside family systems once people begin viewing them as transitional figures instead of fully autonomous individuals. Not gone yet, but already being reorganized around. That realization settled into my chest with cold, terrifying clarity, because deep down I knew the measuring tape at the dinner table had never really been about furniture placement at all. It was about ownership, and whether I intended to surrender mine quietly just to keep everyone else comfortable. The week after that dinner settled into a strange, quiet tension that seemed to follow me through every room of the house. On the surface, everything almost looked normal again because Trevor still called during his drive home from work. Brenda continued sending cheerful little family photos into the group chat, and Lorraine even mailed me a handwritten thank you card for dinner, as though the entire conversation about moving into my home had simply faded into harmless misunderstanding. But underneath all of it, I could feel pressure building steadily. People rarely abandon entitlement immediately after hearing no for the first time, especially when they already spent months emotionally organizing their future around access to something they wanted. Instead, they usually become softer temporarily, more strategic and patient, while quietly testing whether your boundary truly exists or whether it simply needs enough emotional pressure applied against it to collapse over time. Brenda struck me as exactly that kind of person, and unfortunately, Trevor had spent most of his adult life rewarding persistence by eventually surrendering to it. 3 days later, Brenda arrived at my front door carrying 2 large cardboard boxes filled with Lorraine's belongings. I remember standing in the hallway watching her maneuver them carefully past the coat rack while speaking in the same bright, practical tone she always used whenever she wanted something to sound smaller and more innocent than it really was. According to her, the boxes only contained a few things that accidentally shipped early after Lorraine finalized the lease termination on her apartment in Phoenix, and since everyone was apparently still working out details, she figured storing them temporarily in my basement would make the most sense for now. What unsettled me wasn't even the request itself, so much as the confidence behind it, because Brenda never truly paused long enough for me to answer before carrying the boxes farther inside the house as though permission had already been emotionally granted days earlier. That was the moment I fully realized my refusal at dinner had never registered as an actual decision in her mind. To Brenda, it was simply resistance she planned to outlast gradually. After her car disappeared down the street, I walked quietly into the basement and stood looking at the boxes sitting near Daniel's old workbench beside the storage shelves. One contained folded blankets, framed photographs, and decorative pieces obviously intended to make a future bedroom feel settled and permanent, while the other held kitchenware wrapped carefully in newspaper, alongside several small sewing supplies Lorraine used constantly. Standing there in the silence, I suddenly understood this had never really been about temporary storage at all. Brenda was trying to normalize Lorraine's presence inside my home, piece by piece, because once enough belongings quietly settled into a space removing them, later would start feeling emotionally cruel instead of reasonable. People like Brenda rarely force doors open immediately when manipulation can achieve the same outcome more gently over time, and somewhere during those quiet minutes in the basement, I realized she fully intended to wear my boundaries down through gradual emotional occupation rather than direct confrontation. The clarity of that realization steadied me instead of upsetting me. I walked into the garage afterward, pulled out the old hand truck Daniel used for gardening supplies years earlier, and carefully wheeled both boxes back upstairs before placing them neatly beneath the covered front porch where they would stay protected from rain until Trevor picked them up later that evening. The action itself felt strangely calm while I was doing it. Not dramatic, not emotional, simply necessary. Afterward, I sent Trevor a short message explaining that Brenda's boxes were waiting outside because I was not available for storage arrangements inside my house. I kept the wording calm and practical on purpose because over-explaining boundaries often invites people to treat them like negotiations instead of decisions. A few hours later, Trevor called sounding exhausted before he even finished saying hello. Brenda apparently felt embarrassed. Lorraine felt rejected, and listening to my son describe everyone else's discomfort reminded me how often women are expected to absorb disrespect quietly so other people can avoid difficult emotions altogether. Nobody seemed particularly concerned that strangers had started moving belongings into my home without permission. The real problem, according to Trevor, was that I wasn't handling the situation gently enough. I remember standing at the kitchen sink while late afternoon sunlight spilled across the backyard, exactly the way it used to during autumn evenings when Daniel grilled hamburgers for neighborhood cookouts years earlier. Something about that familiar light grounded me emotionally because for the first time in years I stopped questioning whether my own discomfort mattered less than everyone else's convenience. I quietly reminded Trevor that what actually felt rude was assuming my home belonged to other people before I was even gone, and the silence that followed told me the sentence reached him more deeply than he wanted to admit aloud. For a moment, I think my son finally glimpsed the emotional truth underneath the conflict instead of merely reacting to the tension surrounding it. But Trevor had spent so many years avoiding discomfort that he instinctively retreated emotionally almost as quickly as clarity arrived. That had become his pattern. Whenever conversations moved too close to painful honesty, he stepped backward before accountability could fully settle in. Thursday morning brought the moment everything changed permanently. I was watering plants near the sunroom windows when I heard the unmistakable scrape of a key turning inside the front door lock. At first, I assumed Trevor must have stopped by unexpectedly, because years earlier I gave him a spare key for emergencies. But the second the door opened wider and Brenda walked casually inside, carrying 2 oversized tote bags, something inside me went completely still. She acted like she belonged there. No hesitation, no uncertainty. No sense that entering my home uninvited after everything we already discussed might violate basic respect. Instead, she moved comfortably through the hallway while talking about clearing additional basement space for Lorraine's sewing machine and extra furniture, speaking with the relaxed confidence of someone continuing plans already emotionally finalized. I remember staring at her while sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors, and suddenly every smaller moment over the past several years rearranged itself differently inside my memory. The comments about future renovations, the constant references to eventually, whenever my property came up in conversation, the assumptions surrounding holidays and finances and living arrangements, none of it had been accidental. Brenda genuinely believed persistence entitled her to eventual control. I stopped her before she reached the basement stairs, and for the first time since she entered the family, I spoke without softening my words to protect her feelings afterward. I explained very clearly that using the spare key after being told no crossed into trespassing rather than family closeness, and hearing that word visibly shocked her because people become deeply offended once boundaries finally receive accurate names. Almost immediately, her tone shifted from confident practicality into outrage. According to Brenda, I was being selfish, difficult, lonely, and unnecessarily rigid, while refusing to support family during a stressful transition. And listening to her speak, I noticed how naturally she framed Lorraine's housing situation as my responsibility to solve, simply because I happened to own a larger house. But underneath every accusation sat the exact same expectations still waiting unchanged. She believed emotional pressure would eventually overpower my boundaries. That confidence finally cracked the moment I calmly held out my hand and asked for the spare key back. I watched the realization spread slowly across her face while she stood there gripping the key between her fingers, because for the first time since this entire situation began, she understood something fundamental had shifted inside me permanently. I was no longer negotiating. Eventually, she slammed the key down onto the hallway table hard enough to rattle the framed family photographs beside it before storming back outside, and although the front door shook sharply after she left the house, itself felt calmer almost immediately afterward. The tension was finally becoming visible instead of silently absorbed into me. I didn't call Trevor after that because by then I understood something important about my son. Every time conflict erupted between Brenda and me, Trevor instinctively repositioned himself as mediator instead of participant, because mediation allowed him to avoid choosing sides while still feeling emotionally useful. I was done participating in that pattern. Instead, I opened the phone book beside the kitchen counter and called a locksmith. An hour later, the front door lock had been completely replaced, while I stood nearby holding a fresh set of keys in my hand, and emotionally, the moment felt far larger than changing hardware on a house. It felt like reclaiming authorship over my own life after years of slowly surrendering pieces of it simply to maintain peace for everyone else. After the locksmith left, I drove directly to the bank. For years, I transferred a generous monthly amount into Trevor and Brenda's household account to help with school expenses. extracurricular programs, and summer activities for Caleb and Sophie. I originally started doing it after Daniel died because helping financially made me feel useful during the years grief hollowed out so much of my identity. But sitting quietly in the bank manager's office that afternoon, I finally confronted something painful. Money given without boundaries eventually stops feeling like generosity to the people receiving it. Over time, it simply becomes part of their expected lifestyle. So instead of continuing unrestricted transfers into their household account, I redirected every future payment into protected educational savings funds under the children's names. The money still existed entirely for Caleb and Sophie's future, but Brenda could no longer quietly absorb my support into broader plans while simultaneously treating my boundaries like temporary inconveniences. The fallout arrived almost immediately. The following Monday, Brenda called sounding openly furious because summer camp payments had bounced unexpectedly, and according to her, rearranging the financial structure without discussing it first created enormous stress for the entire family. I sat quietly in the sunroom while listening to her, because outside small birds moved between the feeder and the maple branches, while cold autumn sunlight drifted softly across the garden. The contrast between her frantic anger and the calmness surrounding me suddenly revealed the entire situation with startling clarity. Brenda spoke about my money as though it already belonged inside her household structure emotionally, rather than remaining a gift offered voluntarily. And when I explained calmly that the funds still existed fully for the grandchildren's future, but would now remain protected more carefully, the silence afterward carried genuine hostility beneath it. Then she quietly reminded me that we were family, saying the word almost like accusation rather than connection. And for the first time in years, guilt never arrived afterward. Instead, I finally understood something simple and deeply freeing. Family without respect eventually becomes ownership, and I was no longer willing to be owned inside my own life. After I changed the locks and redirected the money into the children's education accounts, the emotional atmosphere surrounding the family shifted in a way that felt both subtle and deeply revealing. Nobody openly mentioned the house anymore during regular conversations, but the silence itself carried resentment underneath it. The kind families create when someone finally interrupts a pattern everyone else quietly benefited from for years. What struck me most was how quickly I transformed from supportive mother into difficult woman simply because I stopped making unlimited access feel effortless. That transition taught me something painful about family systems. People often mistake self-erasure for kindness because self-erasure is convenient for everyone except the person disappearing. Trevor started visiting less after that. At first, I told myself work was probably keeping him busy because avoidance had always been his preferred coping mechanism whenever emotional tension became too uncomfortable to manage directly. But eventually, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Phone calls grew shorter, visits became infrequent, and whenever we did speak, I could feel him moving cautiously through conversations like someone trying not to trigger another conflict, rather than simply talking to his mother naturally. The distance hurt more than I expected. Not because I regretted the boundaries themselves, but because watching your child emotionally retreat from you carries a very specific kind of grief. Trevor wasn't cruel the way Brenda could sometimes be, and that honestly made the situation more complicated emotionally, because passive people rarely look harmful from the outside, but passivity inside unhealthy dynamics creates its own damage slowly. Trevor spent years allowing stronger personalities to shape reality around him, because avoiding conflict felt safer than confronting unfairness directly, and over time that habit taught everyone else in the family something dangerous: that his silence could always be counted on eventually. About 2 weeks later, I attended Caleb's school concert for the first time since all the tension began. The elementary auditorium smelled faintly like old wood floors and cafeteria food, while folding chairs scraped constantly across the gymnasium, and sitting there among parents holding cameras and bouquets of flowers made me strangely emotional, because for a little while, everything almost felt normal again. Then Brenda arrived. I noticed her immediately because she carried herself with the sharp, polished energy of someone determined to control the emotional atmosphere of a room before even speaking. Several parents greeted her warmly while she moved through the aisles, smiling and waving, and for a brief moment I considered quietly leaving before she noticed me, because I already felt exhausted by conflict before it even started. But then Caleb saw me. His entire face lit up from the stage risers when he spotted me near the back row, and watching my grandson wave excitedly through the sea of parents grounded me emotionally in a way I desperately needed. Whatever tension existed between adults, I refused to let it poison my relationship with the children, too. Brenda eventually sat 3 rows ahead of me without acknowledging my presence directly, though I could feel the tension radiating from her posture the entire performance. Trevor arrived late and immediately positioned himself carefully between us afterward, while parents gathered in little clusters near the gymnasium doors and observing him. There stirred something deeply sad inside me, because my son looked less like a grown man managing his own life, and more like someone constantly trying to prevent emotional explosions from stronger personalities around him. That realization stayed with me long after the concert ended. The real shift happened 3 days later when Lorraine called me privately for the first time since all of this began. I remember standing in the kitchen slicing pears for breakfast, while soft rain tapped against the windows, and the hesitation in her voice startled me immediately, because up until then, Lorraine mostly allowed Brenda to speak for her in nearly every family situation. She had always seemed passive and agreeable on the surface, the kind of older woman who smiled politely through uncomfortable moments rather than creating tension openly. But that morning she sounded tired, not physically. Emotionally tired in the way people become after spending too long inside conflict they never fully wanted in the first place. The conversation lasted almost an hour, and what affected me most wasn't anything dramatic, she said directly. It was the quiet shame underneath her words. Once she finally admitted she never felt entirely comfortable with Brenda's plan to move everyone into my house permanently. According to Lorraine, Brenda became increasingly fixated on the idea after Daniel died because she viewed my living situation as inefficient for a widowed woman living alone. At first, Lorraine assumed Brenda simply worried about me aging without enough support nearby, but gradually the conversation shifted away from care and toward logistics, inheritance, finances, and how much easier life would become if the family combined resources properly. Listening to her speak felt emotionally surreal because hearing your own life discussed like underutilized infrastructure changes something inside you permanently. Lorraine eventually admitted something else too. The dinner at my house weeks earlier had not been spontaneous at all. Brenda and Trevor already spent months discussing renovation plans, future room assignments, and even possible ways to restructure the property legally once everyone moved in together. Some part of them genuinely believed the transition would happen eventually, because in Brenda's words, it only made sense long term. That sentence sat heavily in my chest long after Lorraine said it, not because the idea itself shocked me anymore, but because Trevor participated in those conversations quietly while still smiling across my dinner table, pretending everything remained hypothetical. The betrayal inside that realization hurt far more deeply than Brenda's manipulation ever could, because unlike Brenda, my son understood exactly what the house represented emotionally after Daniel died. And still he allowed himself to slowly imagine life inside it, without me truly existing at the center anymore. I don't think Trevor consciously meant to erase me. That's what made it so heartbreaking. Most emotional erasure inside families doesn't happen through cruelty. It happens through convenience avoidance and small, selfish compromises, repeated long enough that eventually the person losing space becomes invisible gradually instead of suddenly. That evening I walked slowly through the house, turning on lamps while darkness settled outside, and for the first time in decades I found myself studying the rooms almost like a stranger might. The hallway photographs, Daniel's workshop, the sunroom windows overlooking the backyard garden, every corner carried years of accumulated memory. Yet suddenly, I could also see how easily all of it might have disappeared beneath someone else's routines if I had continued prioritizing peace over self-protection. Brenda would have renovated the kitchen eventually. Lorraine's furniture would have replaced mine room by room. Trevor would have quietly adapted to avoid conflict. And somewhere along the way, I would have become the older woman occupying the downstairs bedroom inside the very house Daniel and I spent 40 years building together. The realization chilled me deeply because I could suddenly picture the entire future so clearly. Not abuse, exactly. Something quieter. More socially acceptable. Gradual displacement disguised as family care. Women my age are especially vulnerable to that kind of erasure because society romanticizes self-sacrifice in older mothers almost endlessly. We are expected to accommodate a just support, simplify, downsize, and eventually disappear gracefully enough that nobody feels guilty while inheriting the space we leave behind. Sitting alone in my living room that night, I realized how close I came to volunteering myself into exactly that future. The next morning, I met with an estate attorney. Not because I intended to punish Trevor emotionally or sever the family apart dramatically, but because for the first time in years, I finally understood the importance of protecting clarity legally before emotional pressure could distort it again later. The attorney, a calm silver-haired woman about my own age, listened quietly while I explained the situation, and what struck me most was how unsurprised she seemed by any of it. Apparently, inheritance entitlement inside families becomes astonishingly common once widowed parents reach a certain age, especially widowed mothers living alone in fully paid homes. People begin planning around them while they are still alive. That sentence stayed with me. Planning around them, not with them. Around them. Together we updated everything carefully. The house would eventually pass into a protected trust rather than transferring directly through informal assumptions. Specific financial provisions for Caleb and Sophie became clearly structured, and every property decision moving forward would require explicit legal boundaries instead of emotional expectations. Walking out of the attorney's office afterward, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because legal paperwork magically fixed the emotional damage inside the family, but because uncertainty no longer controlled me anymore. For years, I left boundaries vague, because some part of me feared clarity might look unloving. Now I finally understood something much more important. Ambiguity benefits manipulative dynamics far more than healthy relationships ever do. And for the first time since Daniel died, my life was finally becoming unambiguous again. After meeting with the estate attorney, something inside me settled in a way I hadn't experienced since before Daniel died. The strange thing was that almost nothing about my daily routine actually changed on the surface, because I still watered the garden every morning, still drank tea in the sunroom every evening, and still folded laundry while old jazz records played softly through the kitchen speakers the same way I always had. But emotionally, the house no longer felt vulnerable. For the first time in years, I stopped experiencing my own life like temporary space waiting to be reorganized around everyone else's future plans. That shift affected the way I moved through the rooms, the way I answered phone calls, even the way silence felt at night after the television turned off, and the entire neighborhood settled into darkness. The fear underneath everything had finally started disappearing. Not fear of loneliness. Fear of becoming slowly erased while everyone around me called it love. A few days after finalizing the legal paperwork, Trevor came over unexpectedly one rainy afternoon while I was trimming dead leaves from the orchids near the dining room window. The second I opened the front door and saw his face, I immediately understood something had changed because he looked emotionally exhausted in a deeper and more visible way than before. Not angry, worn down. There is a particular kind of fatigue people carry, once avoidance finally stops protecting them from reality, and standing there in the hallway holding a dripping umbrella. My son looked like someone beginning to realize how many years of his life had been shaped by silence instead of honesty. I made tea while he sat quietly at the kitchen table, and for several minutes neither of us spoke very much, because sometimes difficult conversations arrive already exhausted before they even begin. Rain tapped softly against the windows while steam curled upward from our mugs, and sitting across from Trevor there in the same kitchen where he once colored homework pages as a little boy stirred emotions inside me. So complicated I almost softened completely again. Almost. But then I remembered the measuring tape at the dinner table, the boxes in my basement, the key turning inside my front door without permission, and most painfully of all, the realization that my own son had spent months imagining life inside my home while mentally reducing me into an aging figure who simply needed to adjust gracefully around everyone else's plans. That memory steadied me again. Trevor eventually admitted the situation at home had become unbearable. The financial pressure from losing my unrestricted support created tension almost immediately, but according to him, the real collapse started after Brenda realized I was no longer emotionally movable. For years, every conflict in the family eventually bent toward her preferences, because persistence exhausted everyone else faster than it exhausted her. And once she understood the usual pressure tactics no longer worked on me, her frustration spread through the entire household like slow poison. Listening to him speak felt deeply sad, because underneath all the specifics about arguments, stress, and resentment sat a much larger truth neither of us had fully acknowledged before. Trevor built his marriage around emotional surrender. At first, those compromises probably looked harmless from the outside, because passive people often confuse accommodation with love. But over enough years, constantly avoiding discomfort reshapes a person gradually until they stop making clear choices altogether, and instead simply adapt themselves around stronger personalities to maintain temporary peace. And temporary peace always comes at a cost eventually. Trevor admitted Brenda still believed I would come around once enough time passed, because she genuinely viewed my boundaries as emotional overreaction rather than permanent change. Hearing that no longer upset me the way it once would have, because by then I finally understood something important about entitlement. People who benefit from your self-erasure rarely recognize boundaries as healthy when they first appear. They experience them as betrayal. What surprised me most during that conversation was not Trevor's exhaustion. It was his honesty. For the first time in years, my son stopped speaking like a mediator, trying to reduce tension between two difficult women, and instead spoke like someone finally confronting his own role inside the situation. He admitted he should have stopped the conversations about moving into my house long before they ever reached the dinner table, and he acknowledged that after Daniel died, he unconsciously started viewing me less like an autonomous person and more like someone who eventually needed managing. That sentence hurt him visibly once he said it aloud. I could see the shame settle across his face because deep down, Trevor was not a cruel man. Weak sometimes. Passive far too often. But not cruel. And weakness inside families creates damage people rarely recognize until much later. I remember sitting there listening while soft rain blurred the backyard windows, and somewhere during those quiet minutes, I realized I no longer needed my son to perfectly undo the past emotionally. What mattered more was whether he could finally see the truth clearly enough to stop repeating it. That was the real turning point. Not punishment. Awareness. The biggest surprise came 2 weeks later when Lorraine asked to meet me privately for lunch. We sat together inside a quiet little cafe near the botanical gardens where older women gathered after church services, and retired couples shared soup beside the windows. Lorraine looked older somehow than she had at my dinner table weeks earlier, though not physically fragile so much as emotionally humbled in a way difficult to describe. Without Brenda present, she seemed softer, smaller almost, and much more honest. Over coffee and chicken salad sandwiches, Lorraine admitted she planned to move into a senior condominium community outside Asheville instead. Apparently, the entire experience forced her to confront how unhealthy the situation had become, long before anyone openly acknowledged it, and listening to her speak, I sensed genuine embarrassment underneath her words once she fully recognized how aggressively Brenda pushed herself into decisions that never belonged to her in the first place. What struck me most was Lorraine's quiet confession that she never truly wanted to live inside my home permanently anyway. She simply became emotionally swept into Brenda's certainty over time. That realization stayed with me long afterward, because it reminded me how easily stronger personalities reshape reality around themselves until everyone nearby starts adapting automatically, without fully questioning whether the direction itself remains healthy. Autumn deepened slowly after that. The maple trees along my street turned deep orange, while cold evening air drifted through the neighborhood earlier each day. And for the first time since Daniel died, I found myself genuinely enjoying the quietness of my life again, instead of merely enduring it. The house changed too. Not physically at first, but emotionally. I started reclaiming rooms I had unconsciously stopped fully using after years of preparing myself psychologically for eventual displacement. Daniel's workshop became active again once I finally cleaned and reorganized the shelves, instead of preserving everything untouched like a museum to grief. I repainted the upstairs guest room pale green and turned it into a reading space filled with plants, blankets, and old novels, and every small decision seemed to restore another piece of ownership I didn't realize I had slowly surrendered internally. That was the strangest part of the entire experience. Before Brenda ever physically moved into my house, I had already started emotionally shrinking inside it. Now that process was finally reversing. By early December, Trevor and Brenda quietly separated. There was no explosive scandal or dramatic betrayal attached to it, which honestly felt appropriate, because relationships built around avoidance rarely collapse in one giant moment. Instead, they erode slowly beneath years of unspoken resentment, imbalance, and emotional exhaustion, until eventually both people look at each other and realize they no longer recognize the life they constructed together. Trevor rented a small townhouse across town near the children's school, while Brenda moved temporarily into a condominium owned by one of her cousins. And although part of me grieved the pain surrounding the grandchildren, another part understood something difficult, but necessary. Not every marriage survives clarity, especially relationships dependent on one person remaining endlessly passive, while the other remains endlessly controlling. Trevor started visiting more often after that, though differently than before. Our conversations became quieter, more honest, less performative somehow, and for the first time since Daniel died, I stopped feeling like my son only approached me emotionally when he needed stability money or conflict mediation. He simply visited because he wanted to. That difference healed something inside me slowly. Last weekend, I hosted Christmas dinner for the family again. Not the old version of family where tension hid itself beneath politeness and emotional obligation, but something smaller, calmer, and far more honest. Caleb helped decorate cookies in the kitchen while Sophie played records in the living room. Trevor carved the roast awkwardly the way Daniel used to teach him years ago. And after dinner, we sat quietly drinking coffee while snow drifted past the windows outside. At one point during the evening, I looked around the dining room table and realized something profound had shifted inside me over the course of those months. I no longer feared disappointing people. That fear controlled so much of my life after widowhood, because losing Daniel left me emotionally vulnerable in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. Somewhere during the grief, I started believing maintaining closeness required endless accommodation, endless softness, endless sacrifice. But sitting there surrounded by candlelight and familiar voices, I finally understood the truth. Love built on self-erasure eventually stops feeling like love at all. Later that night, after everyone left and silence settled gently through the house again, I carried a cup of tea into the living room and sat alone beside the Christmas tree, while soft jazz played faintly in the background. Colored lights reflected against the windows overlooking the snowy backyard, and somewhere in the quietness, I found myself thinking about how close I came to disappearing inside my own life without fully noticing it happening. Not through cruelty, through accommodation. That was the danger all along. Women like me are taught our entire lives to smooth discomfort, preserve harmony, and make ourselves smaller whenever necessary to keep families emotionally stable. We are praised for sacrifice so consistently that eventually self-abandonment starts feeling noble instead of dangerous. But there is nothing noble about slowly surrendering your autonomy until everyone around you forgets you ever had boundaries to begin with. Sitting there alone beside the tree in the peaceful silence of my own home, I realized the house no longer felt like something waiting to be inherited someday. It felt like mine again. And for the first time in many years, so did my life.
This story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life situations that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. While the characters and events have been shaped for storytelling, the emotions, conflicts, and choices reflect truths that exist in everyday life. At Quiet Revenge Stories channel, every story is created to explore the complexity of human relationships, especially the difficult moments that test trust boundaries and self-worth. These stories are not just about drama, but about awareness, resilience, and the courage it takes to protect yourself when it matters most. The message behind our stories is simple, but powerful. Love should never require you to lose yourself, and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Life will sometimes place you in situations where you must choose between keeping peace and protecting your dignity, and in those moments, choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of something real, consider supporting the channel by subscribing to Quiet Revenge Stories channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, each one carrying a lesson, a reflection, or a truth worth hearing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.